Shalom, shalom. Welcome back to Jerusalem. Good to be learning with you again. My name is Michael Lawrence. This week, we are looking at Parashat Beshalach, the Torah portion of Beshalach, the book of Exodus. Interestingly, I want to make a comparison. I want to have a look at the 8th of May, 1948, just before we delve into this week's Torah portion. At that time, May 8th, 1948, the Secretary of State of the US, of the United States at the time, George Marshall, welcomed a leading senior representative, Moshe Sharet, representing the people, the Jewish people in British Mandate Palestine at the time. He welcomed him for a meeting in the US. And there was pressure at that time. Of course, this ended up being just 6 days before the declaration of the State of Israel, where the US were warning Israel, or the Jewish people at the time, to postpone the proclamation of a state and to consent to a truce with Arab neighbors. Moshe Sharet at the time went in to speak with George Marshall, and he said something absolutely important, absolutely critical for us understanding the feeling at the time, 1948. Said Moshe Sharet to George Marshall, he said, "We will be held to blame, us, the leaders in the land of Israel at the time, we will be held to blame by Jewish history if we consent to any postponement in proclaiming our state, without the certainty that the state will indeed be proclaimed after such a postponement." Jewish history will hold us to account. Jewish history will hold us to blame. George Marshall then turned to Moshe Sharet at the time and said the following. He said, "It's not up to me to advise you what to do, but as a military man, I want to tell you this. Don't rely on your military advisors. They are intoxicated with success after their victories. What happens," and I quote, "if there is a protracted invasion? Are you considering how that will weaken you? If you turn out to be right," he says to Moshe Sharet, "and you proclaim your Jewish state, I shall be happy. But it is a very grave responsibility." Indeed it was. And Moshe Sharet came back to David Ben Gurion, and he said to him exactly what he had heard from George Marshall. And Ben Gurion asked him to stand in front of the Mapai, the very large and influential political party at the time, amongst the Jewish people, and asked him not to scare them, but rather to stand and present the case for declaring the Jewish state. And Moshe Sharet just did that and listened to his words. He said, "The risk involved in postponing the proclamation of the state or of independence is graver than the risk in taking the step. Postponement is a graver risk than taking the step. The future we face is very harsh and grave, but it appears that we have no choice but to step forward and to march forward." In fact, he said, and then just a few days later, decisions were taken and the modern state of Israel declared May 14th in Tel Aviv. If we look at this week's parasha, if we look at this week's Torah portion, we see a similar situation going on. We see here that God takes the Jewish people out of Palestine, but not the quickest way towards the land of Israel. If you open to the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 7, we see straight away at the beginning of the Torah portion, "Vayahi Beshalach Paro et ha'am." And it happened when Pharaoh sent out the people, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines. Why? Because it was near, and perhaps the people will reconsider. When they see war, and they will return to Egypt. Indeed, the risks were great. And God took care to make sure that there would be no option of returning, not at least in that immediate time after leaving Egypt. And then if you open at chapter 14, verse 10, we see panic. Pharaoh approached as they stood at the Sea of Reeds. The Jewish people, the people who had left Egypt, and wondered how would they cross. They saw the Egyptians coming after them. Egypt was journeying after them, and they were frightened. The children of Israel cried out to God. In verse 11, they said to Moses, Vayamru el Moshe, were there no graves in Egypt? Why'd you take us out of here to die in the desert? Let us be, and we will serve Egypt. Let us return. We give up. Let us go back, for it is better that we should serve Egypt than we should die in the wilderness. It's interesting. They're faced with that big sea in front of them and they feel like they have nowhere to go. Is the risk graver to go forward into the sea and try to cross it, to try to reach freedom? Or is it better to go back to Egypt and face perhaps the option of no freedom? No freedom from slavery, no independence, no option to be an independent nation on its own, heading towards that promised land. What does Moses do? In verse 13 of that same chapter 14, he stands and he says, do not fear, stand fast and see the salvation of Hashem, see the salvation of God. See what he will perform for you today. You shall never see those Egyptians again. Hashem shall make war for you. Moses beseeches the people to stand and move forward, as did Moshe Sharet together with Ben Gurion those thousands of years later, as they considered the launch, the declaration of a modern state of Israel. Hashem says at line 15, why do you cry out to me? Speak to the children and let them journey forth. As said Moshe Sharet, the future we face is harsh and it is grave, and no doubt in those times in the desert as well as they crossed the sea, the fear was real. The challenges on the way to the promised land were to repeat themselves over and over again. All kinds of errors made by the Jewish people, all kinds of wars and challenges. And yet, like Moshe Sharet, the only option was to say to the people, stand and deliver, go forth. Moshe Sharet said, we have no choice but to march forth, to go backwards, back to Egypt, or back to a time, remember we're talking just years after the Holocaust of the 1940s, too, also then, no option to look back, only to look forward, as difficult as the challenges would be in terms of building a state and fighting our enemies and maintaining a new, young, vulnerable state. So at May 14th, 1948, Ben Gurion arrived at the Tel Aviv Museum, and he stood there at 4 p.m., Erev Shabbat, just before the Sabbath, and as he stood and banged his hammer on the desk, there was a spontaneous singing. Everyone stood and began to sing Hatikva, the hope, which would become the national anthem of the state of Israel. And two then in the desert, after they crossed the Sea of Reeds, when the splitting of the sea had happened, and God had rescued them, and the Egyptians had drowned. When they saw the back of the Egyptians, the Jewish people then, the children of Israel too, broke into song. Not the Hatikva at that time, but actually a song which is very, very famous in our prayers that we say every single day in the morning prayers, and which appears here in this week's Parsha, the song of Az Yashir. And then Moses and the children of Israel chose to sing this song to God. A song of thanks and a song of belief. Begins there at chapter 15 in the book of Exodus. My friends, history has a way of repeating itself. And indeed we see here, when the challenge was there, when there was fear and uncertainty, when the nation of Israel was in transition, two people called Moses stood and delivered a message, both to those around us, both to the world, and to our people, and said, going forward will be tough, but we shall march on through the sea or into our statehood in the modern era. There is no going back. And that is what leaders do. Leaders place a map and a derech, a path for the people to follow, and walk that path and lead from the front, knowing the risks, but building a positive vision for a better and greater future for all those involved. I wish us all to find our path and to find the leaders that we need to lead our nations forward, to lead the globe forward, to lead everyone in this world forward into a great year of 2021, a better year, a healthier year, a safer year. And I wish you all Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem and a very good and safe week ahead. Thank you.